6 teams on a bye for Bye-Mageddon means 6 starting quarterbacks we will not have available. Most notably, Jared Goff, Matthew Stafford, and Sam Darnold. But also, no Jayden Daniels now either. Bryce Young is going to be out this week and Andy Dalton will be starting in his place, but I don't really necessarily think that's a big downgrade either. And we are still waiting to hear more on whether or not it's going to be Justin Fields or Tyrod Taylor for the New York Jets. So in one quarterback leagues, the majority of people watching this probably feel pretty decent about what they're doing at the quarterback position this week. If you're in a super flex league or a 2 QB league, you might be running into a little bit of trouble. Let's go through every single matchup and try to figure out which guys are absolutely smash starts this week, who are some guys that are on the fringe of helping us, and even with all these quarterbacks missing, who are we going to skip on? For Minnesota and the Chargers, Carson Wentz was really close to being a fringe start for me. But for me to put him as a fringe start, I would have needed a ton of negative game script for him, so he threw the ball a ton this week. And given how bad he was against Philadelphia, and the fact that it's Thursday night football against a solid defense currently allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, me personally, I just don't feel like Wentz is the answer. And this Chargers defense has faced some decent teams over the last 4 weeks. Daniel Jones has played very well this season. Tua, obviously not, but then Jayden Daniels and Jackson Dart. So facing those 4 guys and still allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, those are solid outings. And Carson Wentz has been the quarterback 13, 23, and 17 outside of just one QB1 performance so far this year. He also has 4 interceptions and 2 fumbles in his last 4 games. I just don't see the Chargers blowing the doors off Minnesota, and I see this game being competitive and them trying to run the football this week, especially if Aaron Jones comes back as well. If for some reason LA's up by 14, 21 points, then yeah, more than likely, you're going to see Carson Wentz become at least a fringe start. But I think I'd rather risk it with some other quarterbacks first. But Minnesota's pass defense also super solid. They're allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. And they've also faced some pretty decent quarterbacks. Now, last week is what really pushed some of these points up. And they're still allowing the 3rd fewest, so it shows how well they've done against other quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts threw for 3 touchdowns and 326 yards. But prior to that, Dylan Gabriel, he had 190 yards and 2 touchdowns. Rodgers had 200 yards and 1 touchdown. Jake Browning only had 140 yards. He threw a touchdown, but also had 2 picks. And Justin Herbert was the QB2 last week in some horribly negative game script. But prior to that, QB 14, 20, and 20. Again, Thursday Night Football could end up being a defensive battle between 2 really good defensive teams, and if it is, both of these quarterbacks could end up struggling at times. I don't think there's anybody out there that's going to convince me to put Tua in my lineup this week, even if he's my only quarterback. I'll take the 0 because it's probably going to be pretty close to just as good. And that comment right there could come back to bite me in the butt later in the week, but Atlanta's allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. Tua has 6 interceptions in the last 2 games and only 1 touchdown. Now granted, that was the Chargers and the Browns. Both of those defenses are solid, but Atlanta's defense is absolutely on par with them. Another reason why I think Tua could have a miserable week. I'll be honest with you, I would rather risk it with Andy Dalton, who we'll talk about later, than Tua this week. We know now that Michael Penix has been limited with a bone bruise in his foot, and he's been limited throughout practice this week and is considered day-to-day currently. And you gotta wonder if the Falcons make the decision at some point in time, let the guy rest this week, make sure his foot's 100% healthy, and roll with Kirk Cousins instead. It's only Miami, who's not been playing that well this season. Now, over the last few weeks, their numbers against quarterbacks look a little bit better than they did to begin the season. But that would be because they faced Dylan Gabriel last week, and that was in some bad weather, and he only threw for 116 yards. They also faced Bryce Young, and they've also faced Justin Fields. So obviously, there's not a ton of upside among any of those quarterbacks. Justin Herbert, however, did throw for 264 yards and 2 touchdowns against this defense. The good news for Penix is he hasn't been turning the ball over. 0 interceptions over the last 2 games. If he does start, this should be a solid matchup. If he doesn't start for some reason, I would list Kirk Cousins as being a fringe start, just like Michael Penix. So it was announced the other day that Justin Fields was not going to start and that the Jets were going to go with Tyrod Taylor instead. And then it was announced that Tyrod Taylor, yes, I know I'm saying his name, Tyrod, he all of a sudden was going to be limited and is now questionable with a knee injury. So then Aaron Glenn is like, well, I'm not going to tell you who the starter is at this point because we're not 100% sure and something to do with a competitive advantage. So I don't even know who's starting at quarterback this week for the Jets. And because of that, I'm probably just going to sit both of them, even though this matchup against Cincinnati is solid. Make no mistake about it, though, I could easily see both of these guys being like a top 24 quarterback this week. But recording this video right now and not even knowing who's going to be playing, it doesn't do a whole lot of good to throw a whole bunch of guesses out there when we got some other quarterbacks that could be decent options. This may be the first time ever that a quarterback was able to participate in the old timers game before actually taking the field before their regular game. And Joe Flacco, he could absolutely do both of those things. Do not make a comment about how I look older than Joe Flacco. I'm only 37, okay? This dude is over 40. I do not look older than Flacco, so I'm allowed to make some fun of him. But I'll tell you this, Joe Flacco absolutely still looks like he has more than enough left in the tank to be a good starting quarterback. They're facing a defense allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, and Joe Flacco's probably going to be a fringe start all season long. In some tough games, I could see where he doesn't reach a ceiling. In some easy games, though, I could see how he absolutely gets there. Cleveland at New England. New England's defense has been playing well. Mike Vrabel's got a little bit of toughness baked back into this New England Patriots team, and it's showing in their record. But Dillon Gabriel hasn't shown us enough upside to go up against this defense and be in our fantasy lineup. He's been the QB 19, 27, and 22 since becoming the starter. He only has 2 passing touchdowns in 3 games. Good news is he hasn't thrown an interception yet, though. And he's not really throwing for a ton of yards either. He's only thrown for 190 against Minnesota, 221 against Pittsburgh, and 116 against Miami last week in some bad weather. So the upside just has not presented itself, and New England's defense, I think, is a tough enough matchup that we're not going to risk it with Dillon Gabriel as a starter. Over the last 4 weeks, the Cleveland defense is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. And during that time, they have faced Tua, Aaron Rodgers, Carson Wentz, and Jared Goff, a couple of decent quarterbacks that have played well so far this season. The only one that was really bad was Tua. He threw 3 interceptions, and I doubt that Drake May comes close to 3 interceptions again this week. He's done a good job of taking care of the ball this year. He hasn't thrown an interception since week 3, and he's been a quarterback 1 in 5 of 7 games so far this season. He's as close to a must-start as you can get right now, and any talk of MVP votes is extremely warranted. The kid has been playing great football. Jackson Dart had a little bit of luck last week. There was a circus catch, there was a couple of other things that went their way, but even without that luck, Dart was fantastic against a really good Denver defense. And personally at this point, I think he has definitely earned the fact that he's a start every single week. Since taking over as the starter, he's been the QB 11, 16, 3, and 3 again. And he's getting a defense against Philadelphia, allowing the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. And one that he played very well against just a couple of weeks ago, throwing for 195 yards and a touchdown, and also running for another 58 yards and a touchdown on the ground. And that's the great thing about Dart right now. Using his feet, scoring some touchdowns on the ground is helping him provide a pretty nice floor. But how well he throws the football and how good he does through the air is what gives him that top 12 ceiling every single week. Jalen Hurts has been on absolute fire. He's been the QB8 in each of the last 2 weeks. And Philadelphia is throwing the ball a whole lot more right now than what we've experienced at the beginning of the season. So a lot of people talking about Jalen Hurts just not being a good passer, they're kind of eating those words right now. And just a couple of weeks ago, Hurts had 283 yards through the air, threw a touchdown, and ran for a touchdown as well. And with how well both of these quarterbacks have been playing, neither of them are going to find themselves on the golf course anytime soon. But even though they won't be out there, that doesn't mean that our friends over at Caddy Splash can't help you out. I'll tell you one thing, since I started carrying Caddy Splash products in my bag, people are not looking at me nearly as weird as they used to. I mean, my clubs look a lot better for sure. They're still looking at me weird because of my golf game. But whether you're a scratch golfer or a weekend warrior out there with the boys for a couple of drinks and to have some fun, Caddy Splash is going to help you make sure your clubs are looking pristine after every single round. And if you head on over to Caddy Splash right now and use code Headliners, you're going to get 15% off of your order. And like I said, I started carrying their brushes in my bag to help me keep my clubs looking better after every single round. And not only do they look better, but I actually do hit better keeping them clean. So use the link down in our description below or head on over to Caddy Splash, use code Headliners, and make sure you get your Caddy Splash products in your bag before golf season's over. Buffalo and Carolina, we know Josh Allen is going to be a must start, absolutely. He struggled a little bit against Atlanta the last time out, but he's a top 12 quarterback in 3 straight games heading into that point, and going up against Atlanta, he should end up being a good option once again. Every time I try to record this segment and talk about Andy Dalton, I can't help but laugh because he was one of those guys that you hated if he was the quarterback of your team. But now it feels like this gigantic spectacle that we celebrate whenever the Red Rifle gets a chance to start again. Last time Andy Dalton started in place of Bryce Young last year, he actually wasn't that bad. He started weeks 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the 2024 season. He was the QB 19 during that time and also had a couple of top 12 finishes. Honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if Andy Dalton didn't pop up as being like a top 16 option this week. I think it's either going to be really good or really bad. I don't think there's really going to be a middle ground on his performance. If you believe in finding trends and patterns within statistics when it comes to football, then Caleb Williams is about ready to have an absolutely huge week going up against the Baltimore Ravens, who have allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. And here's why. Because so far this season, Caleb Williams has been the QB 9, 20, QB 1, QB 24, QB 10, and then QB 25 last week, which means based on just those numbers alone, he has to be a top 12 quarterback this week. The last 3 quarterbacks that they faced, Matthew Stafford, he was QB 26. But if I remember correctly, there was some weather they were trying to deal with in that game. What about CJ Stroud? He was the QB 1. What about Patrick Mahomes? He was the QB 3. The upside is definitely there for Caleb Williams. And Lamar Jackson, as expected, should return this week to be the starting quarterback. So those of you who have been holding out for him, you're probably pretty excited. However, this isn't the best matchup in the world to do that. From just a pure numbers perspective, Lamar Jackson could end up being just fine. But fantasy points is where you need to be a little bit more careful, because turning the ball over has been a big issue against the Chicago Bears recently. Over the last 4 weeks, they've allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. You want to know why? Spencer Rattler, 3 interceptions. Jaden Daniels, 1 interception. Geno Smith, 3 interceptions. Dak Prescott, 2 interceptions. That's 9 interceptions total if you weren't counting over the last 4 games. So because of that, Lamar Jackson, just take care of the football. If you do that, you'll have a solid week. This is such an insane number that Taylor actually texted me in the middle of editing this video and said, Kyle, did you get the fantasy points allowed correct for the Houston Texans? Because that number seems really low. And even though when I put 4.77 fantasy points in, I knew it was low at the time, when he said it to me in the text, it sounded so ridiculous I had to go look again. But sure enough, that's exactly what it is. Over the last 4 weeks, the Houston Texans are only allowing 4.77 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Sam Darnold had been very hot coming into that Monday night game against Houston, and even on the road, Houston made him look mediocre at times. This is a very, very good defense, and unfortunately, their offense just cannot keep up with the defense at this point. Brock Purdy is expected to return this week, and on the road in Houston, back from injury for the first week. Personally, with me, I would sit him. If it ends up being Mac Jones, I would sit him as well. I just don't see a ton of upside, especially considering the fact that we ultimately don't know about Ricky Pearsall just yet either. He's supposed to play too, but that's not been guaranteed as of this recording. If you have Brock Purdy and you've been waiting on him, you might not have any other choice to start him, but his ceiling could be extremely low. To begin the season, CJ Stroud in 3 games was no higher than quarterback 23. He had a terrible ceiling and a terrible floor to begin the year, but over the last 3 games, something has changed, and he's started to establish a little bit better of a floor, finishing as the QB 15 2 times and the quarterback number 1 overall against the Baltimore Ravens. So going up against San Francisco, to think that he finds himself as a top 15 quarterback again this week, I think is in the cards. He'll be missing Nico Collins, which is not much help, but I still think he's going to throw the ball enough to be able to land himself in the top 15 as long as he doesn't turn the ball over multiple times. Baker Mayfield did not look great on Monday Night Football, going up against basically a backup secondary for the Detroit Lions. He just looked to be a little bit off at times, and it may have been the pressure caused by Aiden Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, and others in the front. This week going up against New Orleans, who's given up the second most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks, he's got an opportunity for a much better upside. And he's been a quarterback 1 in 5 of 7 games this season. I'm back on Baker Mayfield with a ton of confidence. Even without Mike Evans, even with Chris Godwin, he'll still get the job done. Spencer Rattler will probably never be an option in a 1 QB league, unless it's a week like this week where you just need somebody to go out there and get you some points and not ruin your week overall. Last week, Rattler did not look great. He threw 3 interceptions, but he still managed another QB2 performance even with the interceptions. Those 3 interceptions were more than the previous 6 weeks combined for Rattler. He's a great QB2 in Superflex and 2 QB leagues for those of you out there that need somebody to start for you but don't love it. And he's even better on the bench, so if you deal with an injury at any point in time, you're getting a guy with a QB2 floor. Dak Prescott has been a top 9 quarterback in all but 2 games this season, including 4 straight games. He is playing extremely well right now. He's got CeeDee Lamb back, and he's got a ton of options on offense. Jackson Dart just played very well and finishes the QB3 against this same Denver defense. So for Dak Prescott, even though Denver is giving up the second fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, he is still going to be a start for me because there's not too many quarterbacks playing better than him right now. But Dallas's defense is on the complete opposite side of the spectrum because they're giving up the most fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, which is great for Bo Nix. The Cowboys have given up 2 or more passing touchdowns in 3 of their last 4 games. And honestly, the one quarterback that didn't throw for 2 touchdowns, Jaden Daniels, may have if he didn't end up getting hurt and leaving the game early. Bo Nix had to throw the ball 50 times last week, part of the reason why he ended up finishing so high in the rankings. But with that being said, knowing this defense and how this could be a back and forth affair, I still think he could get close to 40. At least 1 interception in 5 straight games now for Cam Ward, and this offense continues to look worse and worse as the season goes on. They're going to try and fix some things, but until I see that for multiple games in a row, Cam Ward will not be an option in any type of league. Daniel Jones continues to get the job done, and this matchup against Tennessee this week could be a little bit more difficult. They are allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, but Daniel Jones should still have a solid floor. He was the QB 11 back in week 3 when they played Tennessee the first time, but he continues to play well even since then. He now has back-to-back top 12 quarterback finishes over the last 2 weeks. He's thrown at least 212 yards in every single game this season, and his TD to interception ratio right now is 10-3. He's got a lot of really good weapons around him and a great game plan every single week, and because of that, he's taking advantage of his competition. This may be one of the most anticipated games of the week, and I would not be shocked on Sunday Night Football if it's one of their most watched games of all time, because there's going to be a lot of people interested to see what happens with Aaron Rodgers facing the Green Bay Packers for the first time, and Rodgers going up against the guy that replaced him, Jordan Love. Jordan Love has been a solid quarterback too all season long. He doesn't present quarterback 1 upside every single week, but that's not necessarily a terrible thing either. And in this matchup going up against Pittsburgh, I do believe Green Bay is going to have to throw to keep up. Pittsburgh and Aaron Rodgers are going to try and put it to Green Bay. I guarantee it. Remember what he did to his former team, the New York Jets, back in week 1? He's going to be shooting for numbers just as good, if not better. But that's why Aaron Rodgers is a start this week. Not a fringe start, not a maybe start, a start. If you need someone to fill in for you this week and Aaron Rodgers is an option, there's not a ton of quarterbacks right now that I would be willing to absolutely lock in over him no matter what. There's a few, but not a ton. I'll take revenge Aaron Rodgers any given week. Right before getting ready to record this video, it was announced that Jayden Daniels will miss Monday Night Football with a hamstring strain this week. It sounds like he could end up returning after the bye, but for now, they're going to play it safe with him, and they're going to go with Marcus Mariota against the Kansas City Chiefs on the road. And yes, I will take advantage of some better options than Mariota. Patrick Mahomes now has 4 straight games as a top 5 quarterback, and he gets a defense that has been made of Swiss cheese for a majority of the season. So even though Marcus Mariota is not somebody that I'm looking at on Monday Night Football, if you have Patrick Mahomes, he once again is one of those guys that could be a top option this week. Headliner Nation, that's going to do it for all of the start and sit videos this week, and hopefully you got a ton of information that is going to help you start making some decisions. Leave us a comment down below, like the video, subscribe to the channel, save it to watch it later, hype it up, whatever it may be. Just interact with the video. I would greatly appreciate it. But I want you all to stay safe, I want you all to stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.